The assembly point was Valfjordr, Iceland, a sheltered bay of cold, volcanic rock and perpetual gray weather. It was late June 1942. The collection of vessels designated Convoy PQ-17 represented an immense commitment of materiel, the largest and most valuable concentration of Allied cargo, yet directed toward the Soviet Union's northern ports. 35 merchant vessels, mostly American, carrying 297 aircraft, 594 tanks, 4,246 vehicles, and over 156,000 tons of general cargo, estimated by later archival assessment to be worth approximately $700 million in contemporary valuation, were being prepared for the 2,500-mile journey. This was not a routine resupply effort. It was a significant political and military investment into the survival of the Eastern Front. The atmosphere among the command staff was one of controlled, intense anxiety. The nature of the mission was defined by a single, overwhelming logistical imperative: the cargo must arrive. However, the operational challenge was dictated by a single, overwhelming threat: the presence of the German battle squadron based in the fjords of northern Norway. Commodore J.C.K. Dowding, aboard his merchant vessel, held nominal command of the convoy's formation and conduct, adhering to the standard naval procedure for merchant fleets. His command, however, was strictly ceremonial and navigational. The true responsibility for protection lay with the naval escorts, commanded by Commander Jack Broom of the Royal Navy, embarked on the destroyer HMS Keppel. Broom's command group, the Close Escort, comprised 19 vessels, 6 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 4 anti-aircraft ships, 3 minesweepers, and 2 submarines, a seemingly robust but ultimately insufficient shield against the cumulative hazards of the high Arctic. The primary mission parameters acknowledged the unavoidable: German reconnaissance aircraft would locate the convoy quickly. The operational radius of German U-boats, stationed along the known choke points of the route, was understood. The most immediate, existential threat was designated Operation Rosselsprung, the potential sortie of the formidable German heavy ships. Central to this threat was the battleship Tirpitz, the largest and most powerful active warship in the European theater, a vessel capable of obliterating the entire convoy in hours. The intelligence assessments provided to Commander Broom made this threat a psychological and tactical anchor for the entire operation. The route itself, navigating above the 70th parallel, presented environmental hostilities that rivaled enemy action. In late June and early July, the sun remained above the horizon for 24 hours a day, a condition known as the midnight sun. This environmental factor rendered concealment impossible, offering continuous daylight for German air surveillance and bombing runs. The constant glare and the inability to use darkness as a cover were designated a force multiplier for German air assets. Furthermore, the convergence of the Gulf Stream with the Arctic currents produced sudden, massive fog banks and treacherous sheets of ice, compromising both visibility and navigational safety. The cold itself required continuous maintenance of equipment. Ordnance, hydraulics, and radio systems were highly susceptible to failure due to sub-zero temperatures. The convoy set sail on June 27, 1942. The initial stage was marked by rigid formation and radio silence. The first enemy contact was anticipated within 48 hours. By the end of the first day, the first signs of German intelligence penetration were observed: an unusual increase in localized radio traffic from the Norwegian coast, decoded by the Admiralty's Signals Intelligence Unit, Bletchley Park, and relayed to the British Home Fleet. The nature of this traffic suggested immediate and precise knowledge of PQ-17's course and composition. This implied a sophisticated, dedicated surveillance operation. On June 29th, the anticipated reconnaissance aircraft, a long-range Focke-Wulf FW200 Condor, sighted the convoy at 67 degrees 58 minutes north. The confirmation was immediate and chilling. The trap had been sprung. The intelligence was passed directly to the German Naval Command, triggering the first stages of Operation Rosselsprung. The subsequent movements of the German heavy ships, including the Tirpitz, the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, and the heavy cruiser Lutzow, were confirmed as preliminary. The engagement was no longer a question of if, but when, and with what overwhelming force. The survival of PQ-17 and the fate of its irreplaceable cargo was now reduced to a desperate equation of speed versus striking power. The pressure on the senior command in London, responsible for the overall strategic safety of the convoy, began to mount inexorably. The first few days of July 1942 established the operational conditions that would define the convoy's fate. Constant harassment coupled with the crippling effects of the high-latitude environment. After the initial sighting by the German reconnaissance Condor, the attack sequence commenced with methodical, relentless frequency. The primary vector of assault was the Luftwaffe's Fliegerführer Nord, utilizing both high-level bombing and the more dangerous, low-level torpedo attack tactics. These strikes were facilitated by the perpetual daylight of the midnight sun, which provided no period of respite or concealment for the vessels. On July 2nd, the first confirmed engagement occurred. A group of Heinkel He-111 bombers, specially adapted to carry naval torpedoes, executed a coordinated attack. The tactic involved dropping flares to isolate targets, followed by a simultaneous torpedo run from multiple directions, a strategy designed to overwhelm the limited anti-aircraft defenses of the merchant ships. The defense relied heavily on the escort destroyers' anti-aircraft fire and the relatively light weapons mounted on the merchant vessels themselves. The British crewed freighter SS Navarino was struck, and the resulting explosions of its high-octane aviation fuel cargo were catastrophic, sending a column of black smoke high into the Arctic sky, the first confirmed loss of PQ-17. The sinking served as a chilling, definitive sign to the remaining 34 merchant captains that this was a mission of calculated attrition. Simultaneously, the environmental obstacles mounted. The convoy's northern edge was constrained by the edge of the polar ice cap, an impenetrable barrier known to the sailors simply as the ice wall. This forced the convoy into a narrow corridor of relatively open water, situated dangerously close to the German-occupied coast of Norway. This navigational constriction reduced the available maneuvering room, rendering evasion of both U-boats and aircraft a near impossibility. Furthermore, the constant freezing temperatures presented chronic mechanical failures. The fire control systems on several escort vessels began to seize, and the exposed rigging of the merchant ships accumulated thick layers of ice, shifting the vessel's center of gravity and severely compromising stability. The constant effort required to chip away this frozen deadweight further exhausted the crews. The strategic shadow of the German surface fleet deepened. Intelligence updates, relayed from the Admiralty in London and filtered through Commander Broom, confirmed the incremental advance of Operation Rosselsprung. The Tirpitz, accompanied by the heavy cruisers Admiral Hipper and Lutzow, along with a squadron of accompanying destroyers, had moved from their usual anchorages to a more forward position in the fjords near Alten Fjord. This movement brought them to within striking distance of the convoy, a distance measurable in mere hours of high-speed transit. The primary concern was the cruiser force, a covering force of 4 heavy cruisers, HMS London, HMS Norfolk, USS Wichita, and USS Tuscaloosa, commanded by Rear Admiral Lewis Hamilton, which was tasked with interdicting the German heavy ships should they sortie. However, the cruiser force was operating under severe constraints, primarily the distance and time required to reach the German squadron before the Tirpitz could inflict irrecoverable damage on the convoy. A critical point of failure in the entire operation was the extreme reliance on radio direction finding, RDF, and code breaking, Ultra, from Bletchley Park. While Ultra Intelligence provided confirmed reports of the German heavy ships' movements, these reports were necessarily delayed, often by several hours. In the context of a high-speed naval engagement, this delay could mean the difference between interception and annihilation. The Admiralty Command in London, led by Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, was receiving near-constant updates, creating an environment of intense, reactive decision-making based on incomplete and temporarily compromised information regarding the German position. By the evening of July 2nd, 2 more merchant ships, the SS William Hooper and the SS Fairfield City, were successfully targeted by torpedo bombers. The merchant captains and crews, despite the growing losses, maintained formation discipline under Broom's determined escort. The close proximity to the ice, the freezing spray, and the relentless enemy action had created a perpetual state of high-alert exhaustion. The shadow of the Tirpitz was not a distant possibility, but a palpable, immediate threat, leading to a constant internal debate among the escort commanders. Would the admiral in London authorize the cruiser force to risk interception, or would they be left to face the German battle line alone? The fate of the cargo and the men now hinged entirely on the strategic calculus being made hundreds of miles away. The morning of July 4th, 1942, was deceptively calm, a brief meteorological reprieve in the relentless Arctic environment. The convoy, having sustained its initial losses, maintained its disciplined formation. Commander Broom, aboard HMS Keppel, noted the diminished presence of the Luftwaffe, an anomaly that immediately generated unease among the escort command. The lull was not viewed as a cessation of hostility but as a tactical pause, the calm preceding the surface engagement for which the entire operation had been prepared. The expectation, confirmed by continuous, though delayed, ultra-intelligence from Bletchley Park, was the imminent sortie of the German battle group. The ultimate strategic authority rested with Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, the First Sea Lord, in London. Pound's primary concern was the Tirpitz. He was haunted by the memory of the German cruiser Admiral Scheer's solitary attack on Convoy HX-84 in 1940, where the cruiser annihilated the majority of the merchant fleet. The destruction of PQ-17 by the Tirpitz, a ship capable of delivering a far greater concentration of fire, would be a geopolitical disaster, not merely a naval defeat. Pound had been receiving reports suggesting the Tirpitz was already at sea, a misinterpretation amplified by the inherent delay and ambiguity of the signal's intelligence. A confirmed sighting of the German heavy ships at sea had been signaled to London, but the precise distance and speed were contested. At 21:11 hours, 9:11 p.m., the first catastrophic order was transmitted from the Admiralty to Broom and the cruiser force. It was designated immediate priority. Convoy is to disperse and proceed to Russian ports. This instruction, communicated in 5 stark words, instantly destroyed the tactical integrity of PQ-17. A convoy's strength is predicated on its cohesion and the concentration of its defenses. Dispersion transformed 34 well-organized vessels into 34 individual, slow, and lightly armed targets spread across hundreds of square miles of ocean. Broom, receiving the signal, recognized the catastrophic implication immediately. He ordered the signal to be confirmed, believing it to be a decoding error or a malicious deception attempt. However, the command was ratified by 2 subsequent, even more alarming messages. At 21:23 hours, 9:23 p.m., the second signal arrived. Owing to heavy enemy surface forces convoy is to disperse. This confirmed the Admiralty's panic regarding the perceived proximity of the Tirpitz. The third and most devastating signal arrived at 22:36 hours, 10:36 p.m., escort to withdraw westwards at high speed. This final order, the twist, was the most critical. It commanded the most potent defense assets, the destroyers and accompanying warships, to abandon the merchant vessels and retreat. The logic behind this was solely to save the destroyers from the impossible task of confronting the Tirpitz and to position the cruiser force for a potential engagement west of the expected German position. But the immediate, tangible effect was the deliberate removal of all centralized command and protection from the merchant ships. Commander Broom was now faced with a fundamental breach of naval doctrine. The core principle of convoy escort was to protect the cargo vessels to the last possible moment. The order demanded the abandonment of the men and materiel entrusted to his command. The psychological impact on the merchant captains was immediate. They realized they were no longer part of a collective mission but isolated, expendable units. The radio airwaves, previously silent, erupted with urgent, panicked messages and requests for clarification. The merchant captains were left with an impossible dilemma: proceed, as ordered, alone, toward a coast swarming with U-boats and aircraft, or attempt to retreat back toward the safety of the ice, knowing that retreat meant abandoning the cargo that had cost so much already. The sense of betrayal was profound, a clinical breakdown of the chain of command that transformed a calculated military risk into an unforgivable human sacrifice. The Tirpitz had not fired a shot, yet its mere perceived threat had achieved a strategic victory. the dismemberment of the largest Allied convoy in the Arctic. The implementation of the Admiralty's final signal, the order to disperse and for the escort to withdraw, commenced at 2300 hours on July 4th. The execution was conducted under a twilight that never fully darkened, illuminating the profound disarray. Commander Broome executed his orders with professional discipline, though the records indicate the decision was met with absolute professional and personal anguish among his officers. The 6 destroyers of the close escort, ships that represented the primary anti-submarine and air defense, altered course and accelerated westwards. Their departure, swift and purposeful, was observed by the merchant captains as a definitive act of abandonment. The effect on the convoy formation was immediate and devastating. The disciplined lines that had endured days of air attack dissolved into chaotic individual vectors. Captains of the merchant vessels, having been given the impossible directive to proceed alone toward their destination, were forced to make isolated, instantaneous strategic decisions. Some ships, in small groups of 2 or 3, attempted to hug the edge of the ice wall to the north, seeking a meager form of cover, despite the increased navigational risk. Others steered southeast, attempting the most direct route to the relative safety of the White Sea, accepting the near certainty of encountering concentrated German assets. The radio silence, previously enforced, was broken by fragmented, desperate attempts by captains to coordinate movements, transforming the airwaves into a cacophony of fear and confusion, which served only to provide the enemy with precise triangulation data. The German response was swift and predicated on the sudden tactical opportunity. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat arm, received the intelligence of the convoy's dispersal, an unprecedented gift, and immediately ordered the activation of the dedicated U-boat wolf packs operating in the vicinity. The dissolution of the convoy formation rendered the hydrophone and Arctic defenses of the destroyers ineffective. Instead of hunting a cohesive unit protected by anti-submarine warfare specialists, the U-boats were now presented with numerous, slow-moving, unescorted targets. The hunter had become the hunted, with no shepherd remaining. The initial kills were achieved within 2 hours of the escort withdrawal. The American freighter SS Daniel Morgan, carrying high explosives and locomotives, was targeted by U-88. The torpedo struck amidships. Due to the highly volatile nature of the cargo, the vessel did not merely sink. It detonated in a massive, incandescent flash that served as a morbid beacon for miles around, signaling to every remaining vessel the grim reality of their isolated position. This loss marked the beginning of a 48-hour period of systematic German predation, an operational phase the German U-boat commanders termed the Skyspion, shooting gallery. The suspense became absolute for the remaining crews. Because of the vast distances separating the ships and the mandatory radio silence being ignored, the sinking of a vessel was often not observed but only heard, a distant, muffled detonation that echoed across the Arctic waters, followed by a sudden, chilling silence on the frequency. Captains of neighboring ships knew a comrade had been struck, but lacked the resources and were under conflicting orders, preventing them from attempting rescue. This created a pervasive, psychological tension. Every crew was aware that they were being stalked, yet had no means of knowing the hunter's location until the moment of attack. The Tirpitz, the threat that had caused the dispersal, had not yet been sighted, yet its unseen presence was responsible for every sinking. The true danger had materialized not on the surface, but from the depths. This period of individual sacrifice underscored the failure of the centralized command structure. The strategic decision made hundreds of miles away in the Admiralty was being paid for, immediately and graphically, by the lives of merchant sailors facing U-boat torpedoes and dive bombers with only deck guns and their personal courage for defense. The concentration of cargo was now a concentration of targets, and the hunt had only just begun. The dispersal order was definitive, yet the professional instincts and moral certitude of a small subset of the merchant captains resisted the mandate. Among the 34 isolated vessels, approximately a dozen captains recognized that dispersion into the vast, hostile ocean was functionally equivalent to deliberate suicide. Their survival depended not on obedience to a geographically distant, panicked admiralty, but on adherence to the foundational principle of convoy defense: mutual support. These captains determined that a small, cohesive group, however weakly armed, held a significantly higher probability of survival than 30 individual targets. The initiator of this defiance was largely attributed to Captain John K. Wigg of the American freighter SS Bellingham, a veteran of the Atlantic run who possessed an ingrained skepticism toward command decisions made far from the point of danger. Utilizing the unsecured emergency radio frequency, Wigg broadcast a succinct message: "Any vessel maintaining northerly course, stick with me. We will run for the ice." This was not an official order, but an invitation to mutiny against strategic command, based purely on situational logic. 7 other vessels immediately responded, altering their scattered courses to converge on the Bellingham's position. This impromptu group included the tankers SS Winston-Salem and SS Honomu, along with 3 other American and 2 British cargo ships. The formation they adopted was rudimentary, lacking the sophisticated organization of a naval escort. It was, however, anchored by the most powerful deterrent they possessed: the HMS Alice, a small, heavily armed trawler that had stubbornly refused to obey the withdrawal signal, recognizing its primary duty was to the cargo, not the retreating destroyers. The presence of a single, albeit small, naval vessel provided a thin, psychological bulwark against the U-boat threat. This small, defiant contingent steered directly toward the treacherous, northern fringe of the ice wall. The proximity to the ice offered an element of forced tactical advantage. The German U-boats were reluctant to navigate the unpredictable, often shallow waters near the floes, fearing damage to their hulls and rudders. Furthermore, the sheer, unbroken face of the ice provided a massive, stable barrier against attacks from the north, forcing the enemy to approach from the more exposed south. However, this proximity introduced extreme navigational hazards. The ice was a dynamic, unstable barrier. Rogue floes, some the size of small houses, frequently drifted into the path of the slow-moving ships, necessitating sudden course corrections that risked collision within the tight formation. The cold became even more oppressive, coating the vessels in an ever-thickening shell of ice. The crews, operating under continuous exhaustion, knew that stopping to clear the ice meant becoming a stationary target, yet failing to clear it risked capsizing. The mystery cliffhanger of this refusal was the German High Command's reaction. Their intelligence had initially confirmed the complete dispersal of the convoy. When the U-boat reports began to filter back, detailing a small, tightly grouped cluster defying the dispersal, the German command structure was presented with a new, localized strategic problem. Was this a defiant attempt to reform the entire convoy? Was it a decoy, or was it a pocket of high-value ships making a last-ditch run? The German Navy did not immediately commit the Tirpitz or the Hipper to engage this small group, considering the primary hunt of the scattered majority a more fruitful strategic objective. However, they redirected a dedicated U-boat patrol, Group Eisbar, Polar Bear, to track and eliminate this defiant pocket. The 8 ships proceeded north, under constant threat, unaware that the withdrawal of the main escort had failed to provide the safety of obscurity. They were now the specific focus of an elite, submerged hunter group, and the inevitable confrontation was a matter of rapidly diminishing time and distance. Their isolated act of heroism had, paradoxically, made them a priority target. Following the definitive signal of Convoy PQ-17's dispersal, the operational objectives of the German U-boat command shifted from a defensive posture to an immediate, overwhelming offensive. The initial concentration of torpedoes was directed at the main body of scattered vessels to the south. However, the reports filtering from the northernmost operational zone confirmed the existence of a small, unauthorized cluster maintaining formation near the ice wall. This group, led by the SS Bellingham and protected by the lone trawler HMS Alice, was immediately designated an operational priority, less for its specific cargo value and more for its symbolic act of resistance. Corvette and Captain Gunther Schultz, commander of the Group Eisbar, Polar Bear, U-boat patrol, received the order to intercept and eliminate the northern cluster. Schultz commanded 3 Type IXC U-boats, vessels designed for long-range oceanic patrols, now redeployed into the shallow, treacherous waters bordering the polar ice cap. The environment posed significant risks for the U-boats. Navigating the unpredictable underwater topography and the acoustic interference generated by shifting ice flows severely compromised their passive listening systems. However, the presence of continuous daylight, the midnight sun, offered Schultz a critical advantage. The U-boat strategy was one of patient, submerged tracking and coordination. Unlike the chaotic mass-target environment to the south, the northern group's cohesion allowed Schultz to employ classic wolfpack tactics. The plan was to utilize one U-boat, U-655, as a stationary hydrophone post, listening for the rhythmic, distinctive screw beats of the 8 vessels. A second U-boat, U-457, was tasked with a wide flanking maneuver, positioning itself to the east of the convoy's presumed route. The third boat, Schultz's own U-376, would execute the final strike from the exposed southern flank. The men aboard the Bellingham and Alice were acutely aware of the silent, submerged threat. Their primary defense was the meager speed of the formation and the erratic, sonar-confounding interference of the ice. Captain Wigg, utilizing his experience, ordered continuous, random minor course alterations, a tactic known to complicate the U-boat's fire control solutions. Meanwhile, the Alice, with its single, low-frequency ASTIC set, conducted continuous, shallow water sweeps, largely ineffective against a deeply submerged type IXC, but psychologically necessary for the merchant crews. The prolonged period of the hunt was defined by psychological strain. Visibility in the unceasing daylight was absolute, forcing the U-boats to remain submerged at depth, relying entirely on sound. Conversely, the merchant sailors, knowing they were illuminated, were reduced to straining their eyes against the vast, empty expanse of the sea, searching for the telltale wake of a periscope or the faint, dark shadow of a wake. The tension escalated during the brief, scheduled moments when the HMS Alice dropped minor depth charges, a randomized pattern designed not to kill, but to force any potential U-boat to dive deeper, disrupting their attack profile. These small explosions were the only measurable counteroffensive, a futile gesture against the unseen hunter. On the evening of July 5th, the vigilance of the Bellingham's forward watch was momentarily rewarded. Through the continuous spray and the refracted light of the sun, a crewman reported a sudden, unnaturally dark discoloration on the surface approximately 1,500 yards off the starboard bow, the almost imperceptible feather of a rapidly raised periscope. The sighting lasted less than 3 seconds before the object retracted, but it was confirmation of the imminent threat. The signal was flashed immediately to the Alice. However, before the trawler could gain speed and initiate a defensive maneuver, the torpedoes were already running. This direct, confirmed contact introduced the final, immediate element of suspense. The U-boat had found its range. The target was ambiguous, but the trajectory suggested an intent to disable the larger Bellingham or the tanker Winston-Salem. The 8 ships continued to move forward, their fate now resting not on strategic command, but on the precise, mechanical reliability of the German torpedo fuses and the slender chance of successful evasion in the open water. The hunter had revealed itself, and the confrontation was now unavoidable. The faint, dark feather of the periscope, sighted briefly off the Bellingham's starboard bow, was the single, definitive warning preceding the attack. The speed of the torpedoes, approximately 40 knots, gave the exposed vessels a reaction time measured in less than 90 seconds. Captain Wigg, without hesitation, ordered a hard turn to port, attempting to present the U-boat, U-376, with the narrowest possible profile. Simultaneously, the single naval vessel in the group, the HMS Alice, surged forward, its meager twin engines pushing it toward the perceived point of origin, readying its randomized depth charge run. The first salvo consisted of 3 torpedoes. 2 ran slightly deep, their proximity sensors failing to detect the shallow draft of the vessels. The third, however, maintained its calculated depth and trajectory toward the tanker SS Winston-Salem, the most valuable and flammable target in the cluster. The Winston-Salem's helmsman, reacting to the Bellingham's sudden course change and the sight of the torpedo wakes, visible due to the relentless Arctic light, initiated a desperate, unauthorized counterturn to starboard. This maneuver, defying the group's coordinated movement, successfully altered the tanker's position by the crucial final few degrees. The torpedo passed barely 10 feet astern, its wake washing over the rudder, a near miss that constituted a technical evasion but left the tanker's crew psychologically shattered by the proximity of destruction. The HMS Alice arrived over the estimated position of U-376 and immediately initiated a pattern of 6 depth charges. The shallow depth and the surrounding ice floes meant the trawler could not employ a deep attack profile. Instead, the charges were set to a shallow detonation, approximately 150 feet. The resulting explosions were muffled by the water but violently shook the surrounding vessels and caused significant acoustic interference. The deliberate aim was to force corvette Captain Schultz to abort his attack and dive deeper, disrupting the follow-up torpedo solution. The maneuver was successful. The immediate counterattack from the U-boat ceased, and the sounds of the hunter were momentarily suppressed. However, the action drew the attention of the secondary U-boat, U-457, positioned on the eastern flank. U-457 had been tracking the acoustic signature of the entire group and seized the opportunity created by the Alice's commitment to the depth charge run. The attack came not from the anticipated southern direction, but from the unprotected east, targeting the rear of the formation. The victim was the British freighter SS Ironclad, carrying a crucial load of military trucks and crated aviation parts. The single torpedo struck the Ironclad directly below the funnel. The resulting damage was not an instantaneous, spectacular explosion like those observed in the southern, dispersed section of the convoy, but a more insidious, catastrophic breach. The engine room was flooded instantly, and the vessel's backbone was fractured. The captain recognized the futility of damage control and issued the immediate order to abandon ship. The remaining 7 vessels, bound by the necessity of survival and the constant threat of a secondary attack, maintained their course and speed, executing the naval policy of no stopping to rescue during active attack, a rule of chilling necessity in a wolf pack environment. Watching the crew of the ironclad launch lifeboats into the freezing, chaotic water while maintaining forward momentum imposed an extreme moral burden on Captain Wigg and his peers. The exchange left the Defiant cluster reduced to 7 ships, but it affirmed the value of their cohesion. The sacrifice of the ironclad had bought them time and exposed the sophisticated, two-pronged tactical nature of the German U-boat pursuit. The ambush had failed to achieve the total destruction intended by Group Eisbar. The evasion had been successful, but at a severe cost. The suspense was now heightened by the knowledge that the hunter was still submerged, highly motivated, and strategically positioned for another, more refined attack, waiting only for a lapse in the vigilance of the remaining 7 crews. The respite following the loss of the SS Ironclad was tactical, not strategic. The remaining 7 ships of the Defiant Northern Cluster, battered and operating under extreme duress, maintained their course east along the ice wall. The immediate threat of the U-boat had momentarily abated, but the supreme, existential danger, the German battle group, had not been eliminated. It had merely been deferred. The fundamental error of the Admiralty's Dispersal Order, that the Tirpitz was already hunting, was now being revisited, dramatically and unexpectedly. On the morning of July 6th, while the cruiser force was completing its withdrawal to the west, a long-range German reconnaissance floatplane, a Blome and Voss BV-138, sighted the scattered vessels of the main convoy body far to the south. This sighting was followed by another, confirming the location and composition of the heavy German surface fleet. Operation Rosselsprung was in effect. The Tirpitz, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and a destroyer screen, had moved out of Altenfjord and was now positioned to sweep the shipping lanes between Bear Island and Novaya Zemlya. The ghost of the Tirpitz, whose potential threat alone had annihilated the convoy's formation, had materialized. The intelligence was immediately captured by Bletchley Park and relayed to London, confirming Admiral Pound's initial fears, however prematurely acted upon. The situation created a paradoxical, acute dilemma for the German command. The bulk of the merchant ships were already being systematically destroyed by U-boats and aircraft. Committing the Tirpitz to finish the job presented an unnecessary risk of engagement with a potential retaliatory strike from the British home fleet, which was now steaming north. The German objective shifted from hunting the scattered majority to concentrating on the most valuable targets that had escaped, a decision focused squarely on the location of the few remaining functional clusters. It was during this high-stakes strategic calculus that the existence of the northern, Defiant cluster was confirmed by a separate Luftwaffe patrol. The 7 ships, including the valuable tankers, represented the last concentration of irreplaceable cargo. The German Naval Command determined that dispatching the Hipper, a heavy cruiser capable of 8-inch broadsides, with a dedicated destroyer screen to cut off this small group would be a proportionate, decisive action, sparing the Tirpitz from the final, unnecessary push toward the Soviet coast. The 7 captains, relying on their own high-frequency directional finding, HF/DF, and sheer guesswork, noted a sudden, significant increase in German radio traffic directed northeast, a navigational bearing that corresponded precisely to their escape route. Captain Wigg, aboard the Bellingham, conferred by secured, low-power radio with the captain of the HMS Alice. The consensus was grim. They were being targeted by a heavy surface asset. The speed differential was insurmountable. A heavy cruiser could close the distance and annihilate the group in less than 4 hours. Faced with certain destruction, Wigg initiated the final, agonizing strategic decision of the voyage, the sacrifice of cargo. The primary objective had shifted from the delivery of the material to the survival of the men. They could not proceed with 7 ships. The captains agreed to a radical, final dispersal order. They would jettison all unnecessary cargo that could not be quickly unloaded, and then, at a designated moment, scatter the remaining 7 ships into 2 ship pairings, each taking a different heading into the unpredictable, ice-clogged waters. This was not a plan for safe arrival, but a desperate, low-probability strategy for survival, sacrificing the cohesion that had protected them in order to gain the obscurity that was their only remaining defense against the ghost of the Tirpitz and its accompanying hunter, the Hipper. The fate of the cargo was now sealed. The fate of the men remained an open question. The decision by Captain Wigg and the remaining 6 merchant captains to engage in a final, voluntary dispersal was immediately followed by the laborious, frantic process of sacrifice of cargo. The jettisoning was systematic and immediate, targeting items that slowed the ships and were unlikely to survive the intense cold in small lifeboats, thereby clearing the decks for survival equipment. Heavy crated vehicles, damaged aircraft wings, and non-essential deck fittings were pushed overboard. This act was less about lightening the load and more about preparing the vessels for the extreme, evasive maneuvers necessary to navigate the thick, unpredictable ice fields they were now entering. The primary function of this final, organized activity, however, was psychological and tactical deception. Under Wigg's direction, the crew of the SS Bellingham focused on preparing a single, critical radio transmission, the last broadcast. The intent was to utilize the final moments of their cohesion to transmit a piece of sophisticated misinformation intended to directly influence the deployment of the oncoming German heavy surface asset, the Admiral Hipper. The technical preparation involved bypassing standard encryption, utilizing the open, emergency frequency that the scattered convoy had briefly utilized days earlier. The message was brief, transmitted at high power, and formatted to appear as a desperate, last-minute communication from the flagship of the cruiser force, HMS London, not a lone merchant captain. The content of the transmission was deliberately ambiguous but alarming. Cited enemy heavy units 0700 grid reference. False grid coordinates far to the southwest. Proceeding to intercept. All units disperse and proceed west. The effect of this message was intended to achieve 2 objectives. 1. Reinforce the dispersal narrative. By ostensibly originating from a high-ranking naval commander, it validated the initial Admiralty order and reinforced the narrative that the entire convoy had dissolved and was scattering westward. 2. Redirect the Hipper. Most critically, the false grid coordinates placed the supposed sighting far to the southwest, directly along the route the British cruiser force had actually taken days earlier. The message was designed to make the German High Command believe that the British cruisers were now returning for a potential engagement and that the remaining valuable targets, the scattered merchant ships, were retreating to join them. The transmission was brief, broadcast twice, and immediately ceased. The Bellingham's radio operator then dismantled the essential components of his equipment, ensuring no further transmission could be made, a definitive act of operational finality. The reaction at the German Forward Command Post in Norway was immediate. Naval analysts, already operating under high tension regarding the potential return of the British home fleet, received the intercepted message. Its high priority, coupled with the familiar but slightly corrupted British naval codes, lent it an air of authentic desperation. The message directly contradicted the intelligence that suggested the most valuable remaining cargo was in the north. The intelligence officers, concerned about risking the Admiral Hipper in a possible duel with the returning cruiser force, immediately relayed the contradictory information to the overall commander of Operation Rosselsprung. The success of the deception hinged on the paranoia surrounding the Tirpitz. The ultimate goal of the German naval strategy was to keep the Tirpitz operational and intact as a fleet in being, and avoid committing it or its main escorts, like the Hipper, to a risky engagement with heavy Allied units. The false signal created sufficient doubt about the Hipper's route clearance, triggering a critical moment of hesitation and reassessment at the German command level. The 7 vessels then split into their prearranged 2-ship pairings, each taking a slightly different, desperate heading deeper into the ice. Captain Wigg had sacrificed the cargo and risked the men's lives on a single, short-lived radio transmission designed to buy them a few hours of obscurity while the German command wrestled with the intentional disinformation. The final act of defiance was complete, and the subsequent silence across the open frequencies was the only sign of its success or failure. The final dispersal of the remaining 7 vessels occurred on the edge of the navigable sea ice, a region marked by unpredictability and geographical hostility. The vessels split into 3 operational pairs and the lone trawler HMS Alice, which took the most dangerous course further north, acting as a deliberate, visible decoy. The pairings utilized the ice itself as their defense, navigating into the vast, chaotic region known as the Ice Labyrinth, a zone of heavily concentrated, shifting flows and ridges. This area was effectively uncharted, as no operational naval vessel would willingly enter such a hazard, and thus provided a measure of obscurity from both German surface ships and U-boats. The pairing of the SS Bellingham and the tanker SS Honomu, the command element of the resistance, chose a course designed to utilize the thickest, most impenetrable ice coverage. The challenge was immediately overwhelming. The ships, built for open ocean traffic, were ill-equipped to act as icebreakers. The noise generated by their steel hulls grinding against the massive floes was immense, an acoustic signature that might betray their position to any submerged U-boat patrol that dared to follow. Every few miles, the pairing was forced to halt, the captains relying on the agonizingly slow method of reversing and ramming the floes repeatedly to carve a narrow, temporary path. The fear was not only the enemy but the sudden, tectonic shift of the ice itself, which could trap and crush a vessel instantly. The maintenance burden became extreme. Continuous exposure to freezing spray created a solid layer of ice on all rigging, deck fittings, and gun emplacements. The crews were forced into 2-hour rotational shifts, chipping away the frozen mass with mallets and axes, a labor made psychologically crushing by the perpetual daylight and the constant low-level vibration of the engines struggling against the ice resistance. This work was conducted under the knowledge that should they become stuck, they would be immediately vulnerable to air attack, or eventually, the methodical approach of a German surface vessel. The other pairings faced similar, specialized threats. The SS Winston-Salem and its companion ship, navigating slightly to the south, encountered a massive fog bank, a sudden meteorological anomaly that provided a temporary concealment but instantly eliminated all visual communication between the 2 vessels. The ships were forced to rely on the sound of each other's fog horns, a constant, mournful echo that created a new, distinct acoustic beacon for any German listening post. The loss of visual contact in a tightly constrained area introduced the extreme, internal threat of collision between the 2 friendly vessels, an error that would be as lethal as any torpedo strike. The mystery cliffhanger of this phase was the question of the deception's success. Had the last broadcast convinced the German command to redirect the Admiral Hipper south? The silence was the only answer, but silence in the Arctic could mean two things. Either their deceptive gambit had bought them precious time, or the enemy had closed the distance and was now silently tracking them, waiting for a fatal navigational error in the ice. The narrative focuses momentarily on the HMS Alice, the decoy trawler. Operating entirely alone, the small vessel proceeded northeast toward the presumed location of the White Sea, utilizing its small, active radio transmitter to send deliberately sporadic and misleading positional reports. The crew understood they were a sacrificial element, designed to be the most tempting target for any German vessel pursuing the northern course. If the Alice drew fire, the 6 merchant ships had gained the obscurity necessary for survival. The trawler's fate was sealed the moment it turned north, but the sacrifice was a conscious act of command, a desperate, final bid to fulfill the true strategic mission, the preservation of human life, even if the cargo was lost. Their position was now the focal point of all enemy attention, the single point of known Allied resistance in the vast, hostile ocean. The fate of the splintered northern cluster, struggling through the ice labyrinth, was sealed not by their own efforts, but by the strategic paralysis gripping the German command. The last broadcast, transmitted by the SS Bellingham, proved successful in its primary objective, sowing doubt regarding the position and intent of the British cruiser force. The German Naval Command, prioritizing the safety of the formidable battleship Tirpitz over the destruction of the few remaining scattered merchant ships, hesitated. The revelation occurred on July 7th. Having received the deceptive signal suggesting a returning British cruiser force, and noting the difficulty the U-boats were having locating targets in the rapidly spreading chaos of the dispersed convoy, the overall German operational commander made the decisive, war-altering order. Operation Rosselsprung was aborted. The Tirpitz, which had moved to within a few hours' striking distance, was ordered to return to its protective anchorage in Altenfjord. The heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, which had been poised to intercept the northern cluster, was recalled simultaneously. The strategic genius of the Tirpitz, its power to paralyze Allied action by its mere presence, was also its ultimate liability. The German High Command refused to risk the asset in a high-stakes, confusing engagement. The phantom threat had evaporated, a direct consequence of an isolated, unauthorized act of deception. While the supreme danger was receding, the localized hunt for the decoy, HMS Alice, reached its violent conclusion. The small trawler, having faithfully maintained its northeast course and continued its sporadic, misleading radio transmissions, had successfully drawn the dedicated attention of the German air and submarine assets. By midday, the Alice was located by a Junkers Ju-88 long-range reconnaissance aircraft. The sighting report was immediately relayed to U-255, a U-boat operating in the vicinity with the explicit orders to neutralize the last remaining active Allied naval vessel in the area. The encounter was clinical and brief. The Alice, small and slow, possessed neither the speed nor the armaments to evade or defeat the Type VIC U-boat. The German commander, having tracked the decoy for several hours, surfaced briefly to confirm the target. A single, exhausted-looking trawler alone on the vast expanse of the Northern Sea. The U-boat did not expend a torpedo, instead utilizing its deck gun. The shelling was methodical and precise. The Alice returned fire with its single 4-inch gun, a gesture of defiance that was tactically futile. Within 20 minutes, the HMS Alice was structurally compromised and sinking. The crew, having completed their mission, the drawing of fire and the provision of crucial time for the merchant ships, abandoned the vessel in freezing lifeboats, a final, necessary sacrifice. The U-255, adhering to the protocols of war, submerged and departed the area after observing the sinking, leaving the trawler's crew to face the Arctic elements. The sinking of the Alice was the final, measured price paid for the survival of the 6 remaining merchant vessels, and it confirmed the German intelligence that the northern resistance had been completely eliminated. The 6 splintered merchant ships, still battling the ice and unaware of the profound strategic victory their defiance had secured, now faced only the environmental challenge and the persistent threat of general U-boat patrols that had not yet been recalled. Their survival was no longer dependent on large-scale naval strategy, but on their individual endurance against the relentless Arctic environment. The sacrifice of the Alice was a quiet, unrecorded transaction that translated directly into the continued obscurity and eventual salvation of the last remaining cargo ships. The grand twist of the convoy's fate was finalized. The fear of the most powerful German ship had saved the weakest Allied ones. The withdrawal of the German battle squadron, though unknown to the remaining 6 merchant vessels, marked the transition from a period of tactical high-stakes action to one of raw, individual endurance. The final leg of the journey required navigating the treacherous, poorly charted waters leading into the White Sea and the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel. The primary threat was no longer the Tirpitz, but the scattered, opportunistic U-boat patrols that had not yet received the recall order and the unforgiving, cumulative effects of the Arctic environment. The 6 ships, operating in their small, 2-ship pairings, spent the next 4 days battling the ice labyrinth. The pair led by the SS Bellingham and the tanker SS Honomu suffered a major setback when the Honomu's propeller shaft was fouled by a massive submerged ice floe. The vessel was immobilized, requiring the Bellingham to commit several agonizing hours to maneuvering and using its reinforced bow to push and free the tanker from the ice's grip. This incident, while resolved, consumed vital fuel and brought the pair to the brink of a fatal entanglement. The constant exposure and extreme exhaustion took their toll. The chronic failure of the vessel's heating and pump systems meant the crews were effectively living in conditions approaching hypothermia. The lack of sleep induced cognitive errors, resulting in minor navigational mistakes that continually jeopardized their proximity to the coast and the known German minefields. The only reliable marker of their progress was the gradual, perceptible shift in light, as they finally began moving far enough south for the midnight sun to abate slightly, introducing a few hours of twilight, a psychological victory after days of continuous, exposed daylight. The first vessel of the northern cluster to be sighted by Soviet patrols was the SS Winston-Salem, which limped into the Kola Inlet on July 10th. The vessel, carrying a full cargo of aviation fuel, was heavily scarred by ice abrasion and minor shrapnel damage, but intact. The subsequent arrivals were staggered, occurring over the next 48 hours, with the last ship, the SS Bellingham, reaching the safety of Archangel on July 12th. The 6 merchant ships of the Northern Group had successfully run the gauntlet. Conclusion and archival assessment. The immediate assessment of Convoy PQ-17 by the Allied commands was one of catastrophic failure. Of the original 35 merchant vessels that departed Iceland, only 11 ultimately reached Soviet ports, a survival rate of 31.4%. 24 merchant ships were sunk, representing the loss of over 430 tanks, 210 aircraft, and 3,350 vehicles, a military setback of immense proportions. The diplomatic fallout between Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union regarding the Admiralty's order to disperse was severe and prolonged, with the term PQ-17 becoming synonymous with strategic error and abandonment. However, the survival of the 6 ships that defied the Admiralty's order, the heroic refusal, provided a critical counterpoint to the overall disaster. These ships delivered a disproportionately valuable percentage of the total remaining cargo and, crucially, proved that a localized, determined resistance could succeed where large-scale, centralized command failed. The archival records, subsequently analyzed by Bletchley Park staff, confirmed that the localized deception executed by Captain Wigg's last broadcast was directly responsible for the premature recall of Operation Rosselsprung. The strategic victory was not achieving the full convoy's safe passage, but rather preventing the Tirpitz from achieving a total, zero-survivor annihilation of the entire fleet. The story of PQ-17 is thus defined not merely by loss, but by the contrast between strategic failure and individual heroism. The men of the merchant ships, abandoned by their naval protectors, relied on personal conviction and collective courage to turn a dispersal order into a calculated, desperate chance for survival. The ultimate irony remains. The convoy was annihilated not by the enemy's weapons, but by the strategic fear of a weapon that never fired. The successful delivery of the remaining cargo proved that in the harshest theater of war, survival was often the result of an insubordinate refusal to accept the inevitability of defeat. The Arctic convoy trap was sprung, but 6 ships fought their way out using cunning, discipline, and the willingness to sacrifice everything but the core mission.